So, you've probably heard all this talk across Europe about working less. The 4-day work week, finding a better work-life balance. It's a huge conversation. But then you look at Greece, and the story is, well, completely different. They just passed a law that could open the door to a 13-hour workday. It seems to fly in the face of everything. So what on earth is going on here?
Right, so this is the central puzzle. At a time when so many countries are trying to figure out how to work smarter, not harder, to boost their economies, why is Greece legislating for potentially longer hours? It's a move that sparked massive strikes and a whole lot of controversy, and we're going to dig into why.
And this slide just lays out the divide perfectly. On one side, you have this huge trend, all these experiments with shorter work weeks. And on the other side, you have Greece. Just last year, they brought in a 6-day work week for some industries, and now they followed it up with this 13-hour day rule. You really couldn't get more different.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole thing so baffling. Despite some old stereotypes, the data is absolutely crystal clear. According to the OECD, in 2023, Greeks were already ranked 5th in the entire world for the most hours worked in a year. 1 in 5 Greeks works over 45 hours a week. That is the highest rate in the entire European Union. So why on earth would you add more?
Well, to understand the government's thinking, we have to look at the economy. And if you just look at the headlines, things have been looking surprisingly good. There's been a lot of talk about a Greek comeback. Some have even called it an economic miracle after so many years of crisis.
Let's just do a super quick rewind for context. The 2008 financial crisis absolutely hammered the Greek economy. GDP just collapsed by a quarter. Unemployment went through the roof. And debt? Well, it ballooned over 200% of GDP by 2020. It was a brutal, brutal decade. But as you can see, that debt number has actually started to come down in a big way.
And here it is. This is the key statistic that's been driving that whole miracle story. For the last few years, Greece's economy has been growing faster than the euro area average. The government has held this up as proof that all those painful reforms from the last decade are finally paying off. But is that the whole story?
Well, once you start to peel back the layers, a much more complicated picture starts to emerge. A recent study actually called it Greece's cafe economy, and that nickname really helps explain what's going on under the hood.
So take a look at this. This chart shows where the growth is really coming from. It's almost all from sectors that use a lot of labor but aren't very productive, like tourism. So between 2009 and 2023, the number of jobs in tourism shot up by 87%, which sounds great. But the actual economic value that sector produced, it only grew by 11%. So the bottom line is you have a lot more people working for very little extra output.
And that has had a truly devastating effect on productivity and wages. In that same time period, overall labor productivity actually fell by 16%. And real wages, that's what you can actually buy with your paycheck, they collapsed by up to 35%. And if you were in the tourism sector, it was even worse. Some of those wage drops hit 60%.
And this isn't just a bunch of abstract numbers, right? This has a massive, real-world human cost. A report from this year found that nearly half, almost 50% of all Greek households can't afford basic necessities. Think about that. They're working some of the longest hours in the world, but their actual purchasing power is the second lowest in the entire EU.
So when you're faced with conditions like that, what do? Well, for over 1 million people, the answer has been to leave. Over 1 million working-age Greeks have left the country looking for better opportunities. And this massive brain drain has created huge labor shortages, especially in those key industries.
Which brings us right back to the new law. This legislation is the government's answer to this perfect storm they're facing: falling productivity, low wages, and a critical shortage of workers.
So what does the Fair Work for All law actually do? Well, in a nutshell, it lets an employee take on a second job and work up to 13 hours in total in a single day. Now, the standard 40-hour week at your main job technically still applies, and there is a cap on overtime per year. But it's really aimed at those seasonal sectors like tourism that are desperate for workers.
As you can imagine, this whole thing is incredibly contentious. The government and its supporters argue that they're just making official what's already happening. They say people are already working second jobs under the table, and this law just makes sure they get paid properly and have protections. But critics, from labor unions to opposition parties, are warning that this law basically legalizes worker exploitation, especially since Greece is known to have pretty weak workplace inspection systems.
And all of this leads us to the fundamental question, right? Can simply working more solve these really deep-seated economic problems that Greece is facing? Or could it actually end up creating even bigger problems down the line?
Labor experts are pointing to some really serious long-term risks. For one, longer hours can lead to worker burnout and health problems, which, ironically, ends up reducing productivity. Then there's the brain drain. Harsher working conditions could push even more young, talented people to leave the country. It could also make it harder for families to have kids, making Greece's demographic crisis even worse.
There's a quote from our source material that really just sums up the whole criticism perfectly. It says, "The idea that simply working harder than everyone else will drive an economic recovery is unlikely to succeed. The argument here is that a real, lasting recovery has to come from innovation, from becoming more productive, not just from asking a workforce that's already exhausted to work even longer hours."
And really, that leaves us with the final question, the one at the heart of this whole debate. In the 21st century economy, is working harder really the same as working smarter? Greece is betting its entire recovery on one answer to that question, while much of the rest of Europe seems to be betting on the complete opposite. Only time is going to tell which one of those bets